Hi, and welcome to Studio SN. My name is Sara Naumann, and I'm really happy to bring you a very special stamping project this week using Eclectica stamps from PaperArtsy. I'm really pleased to be one of the guest bloggers on their blog today. So when you're done watching today's video, you might want to pop over to their very tempting website over at paperartsy.co.uk. Don't say I didn't warn you, but they have a ton of very cool stuff over there. In the meantime, please enjoy today's show, and thanks so much for watching. This little journal is 6 inches or 15.5 centimeters square, and it features a stamped piece of white tissue paper that's collaged on top of a photo. It's a really easy technique, and it's a great way to use word stamps as the foreground of a piece. It's also a lot of fun to incorporate your photos into your artwork, and because it's square, it's perfect for those Instagram pictures. And of course, I'm showing it to you on a journal cover, but of course you know that you can also do the same technique for card making, altered arts, or whatever you happen to be working on at the moment. So let me show you the supplies that you'll need. Of course, you're going to need to start with a photo, and I mentioned this is an Instagram picture, and I just printed it off onto my home printer onto standard weight white cardstock. You don't need really thick cardstock for this, but you do need something heavier than a regular printer paper because you're going to glue your white tissue paper on top using a Mod Podge or something similar. So the cardstock needs to be sturdy enough that it can accept a wet medium. So you'll need your photo. When you print this out, go ahead and make sure that it is really dry before you do any gluing with it, so then that way the ink doesn't smear. You'll also need a piece of white tissue paper, and this is what you're going to do your stamping on, and you'll also need your stamps. And the stamp set that I'm using is the Eclectica line. This is ESN 01, and this is from PaperArtsy. And when I designed the stamp set, I wanted it to be something that would do double duty for not only art journaling, but also for card making or journal covers or whatever type of paper craft you like to do. So it's got a lot of really fun collage words on it. It's got some accent pieces here, some word snippets, and some word fragments as well. You can always use just 1 or 2 of the stamps. For this journal cover, though, I used 10 of the stamps to create a collage with all of these pieces together. So to do that, of course, you're going to need a block for your stamps. So let me scoot these aside and show you how I've done this. You can stamp all of your stamps onto your tissue paper using just one stamp at a time, of course. But I found that it's easier to really group them all together, figure out how you want them to go, and then stamp it as one unit. And I played around a little bit with the placement of this before I stamped it onto my real tissue paper. So I used some scrap tissue just to figure out the placement where I wanted the stamps to go onto my photo before stamping onto the tissue. One question you may have in your mind right now is, why don't you just stamp onto the photo? Well, I tried that. It didn't have the effect I really wanted for this. So here's an example of it. This is just stamping the collage of stamps directly onto the photo, and you can see it looks fine. It didn't have the same level of depth that I really wanted. So this is, again, this is the original. You can see it's got that kind of cloudy, ghostly effect and a really fun vintage look. This just seemed a bit flatter to me. So it wasn't the effect I was going for. So instead of just stamping directly on here, I decided to stamp onto the tissue paper instead. So again, putting all of my stamps onto one block. This is a 5x7 inch flexi block from PaperArtsy. And it's great because it fits a bunch of stamps onto it, but it's not this great big hulking thing that you can't get your hand around. So it's a nice lightweight for it too. I'm stamping with Ranger's Jet Black Archival ink, and the important thing about this is that it is permanent and waterproof. So again, because you're using a wet medium with this, you don't want it to be a pigment ink or something that is going to blur or smear or get all over the place. I'm putting the ink pad to the stamp rather than trying to do the other way around, making sure it's nice and inky. Normally when I go to stamp something like this, I would stand, but I'm filming, so I need to stay seated. So I'll do it the best I can. Simply place it down onto my tissue and press. Now, rather than doing this thing where you're like crunching your wrist and your hand, you do need to press relatively firmly to make sure you get all of the detail, but sometimes I like to take something that's a little bit heavy, like a punch, and just use that to kind of help me with some leverage, and also standing does help. But the nice thing about this is that even if your results are less than a perfect impression, you can still use it. Okay, so I've got my stamped design on here. I do need to let this dry as well. So I've got a piece that is already dry, so I'm going to move this one aside and bring this piece back in. And I can go ahead and glue it onto my photo. So bringing back in my photo, so this has dried, the ink on here is dried, it's ready to be glued together. As I mentioned, using Mod Podge or something similar. I like to use a foam brush to do the application here. You can also use a paintbrush, or you can even use your finger if you want to. And I recommend putting the glue onto the cardstock weight. If you try and put the glue onto the back of the tissue paper, you know what's going to happen. It's going to crinkle back on itself. It's too wispy to really have much of a body to it. So the chances of it sticking to itself and causing lots of frustration are pretty high. So just trust me on that one. So put your Mod Podge onto your photo instead. So I'm just going to dip in my foam brush. And you don't need to have a really thick application. I think where people end up with air bubbles or gloppy bits or the glue spilling out onto the edges is when you just use too much. So the foam brush really helps with the application of that. Think of it as the kind of consistency or the coverage of fingernail polish. So if you're putting fingernail polish on, it's going to be about the same consistency. So you don't need to have a really thick layer on here. It's best not to. Okay, so I've got my Mod Podge on there, and then I can go ahead and take my stamped piece and just position this down on here. So I've set it down, starting from the center. I'm going to smooth out toward the sides. If you get any wrinkles or air bubbles, just gently sort of smooth them out like this. It really helps to not go too far into the margins there, because what you can also do once you have this done, flip it over and take a little brayer, or you could take that punch again and really flatten it down. Okay, so that you're getting out all of those air bubbles. Then all you need to do is let this piece dry. So you can see I've got some wrinkles in here. I'm just going to work at those and gently smooth them out. Okay, I see I need a little bit more of the Mod Podge in here, which is fine. Just add a little bit more, flatten it down, and then let this dry. Once it's dry, it's going to look something like this. So I can go ahead and trim around the outside edges. You'll notice that it starts to curl up a little bit, which is fine. I'm going to add a little bit of paint around the borders of this piece. So after I do that and I let the paint dry, then I would put this under a stack of books and let it really flatten out. The paint that I'm using is Distress Paint, and this is in Picket Fence, and you'll need to give it a bit of a shake till that ball rattles and you know that it's well mixed. This is a pretty watery paint. You can use lots of different kinds of paint for this. This was what I happen to have on hand. And using the dabber top, I'm just going to go shuffling around the sides. I'm not worried about it being too precise, because of course I do want that sort of shabby chic effect. I don't want it to be too thick, because I want to keep that that sort of tissue paper transparent effect in there. So this is going to be just as much as I need. Let me clean up this bit here on my craft sheet. And then what I'll do, let this dry and then put it under a stack of books and it will flatten. But you can see how nicely that really creates a frame around the outside edge, and then at the same time it kind of blends between the stamp, the tissue, and that background. Once this is dry, I can go ahead and glue it onto the front of my cardboard piece, which is my journal cover. So let me bring back in my journal and I'll show you how I've put this together. So here's my collaged piece right here. I inked around the outside edge using that jet black archival ink, just to give it another layer of dimension between that and the chipboard piece here. Now the cardstock, or the chipboard piece that I'm using as my journal cover, looks like this. It's just a piece of fairly sturdy chipboard, brown chipboard. I painted around the outside edges, as you can see, with that same Picket Fence white paint. And then what I did is I glued this onto the front and then hole punched. And I was able to use a standard, this is a 1/4-inch circle hole punch, just a handheld hole punch, nothing fancy. And that was able to go through that. And then I could do the binding with these silver metal rings. So the metal rings look like this, and you can get them at office supply stores. I think I bought a box of 250 of them at Staples. So something like this is great for bookbinding, and then it just clips together. And it's easy to undo it too, so you can add pages or move pages around. And then I've also tied around the outside of each one of those binding clips, a few bits of ribbon. So I've got twine, hemp twine. I've got this kind of rainbow ribbon here. I've got a piece of silk, cream silk ribbon, which needs to be ironed. And then I have a piece of off-white lace. So these are the 4 that I tied around both top and bottom of those rings, just to add a little bit more softness to it. So for the inside of my journal, you just lined the inside with some green cardstock, and then this has been painted white as well. All of my pages are either envelopes that can be used as pockets, or they're tags, or they're scrap cardstock that I pulled out from my cardstock pile, things that were too small to use for other things, but then would work nicely for a mini album page. And I kind of like having pages of handmade books be bigger or kind of extend past the book cover itself, because I think it adds a little bit more interest to it as well. So here are some more of those envelopes. And basically the flap is sealed shut, and then I just trimmed off one side, and then I've got some fun pockets to tuck things into. And the back cover is also lined with that green cardstock, and it's just another piece of that chipboard painted white. So nothing fancy for the back cover, although you certainly could do some more collaging back there if you wanted to. So this is how you can create a very fun collage effect using Eclectica stamps and a really fun and easy tissue paper collage technique. I really hope you enjoyed today's show. Hey, for more information on the Eclectica stamp sets, please pop on by the PaperArtsy website, and they're over at paperartsy.co.uk. I've also posted on their blog today with step-by-step photo instructions for this project. Thank you so much for joining me on Studio SN, and I will see you again next time.